wonderful to have done that. We have used every chair in the library that an adult can sit in. So, no, not quite. Thank you. Welcome to Chats with Champions, presented by Skidompha Library and sponsored by Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshop. Our next chat will be Thursday, July 14th, when we will welcome Rob Snyder, President of the Island Institute. Today, we welcome Pulitzer Prize award-winning and New York Times best-selling author, Richard Russo. Russo grew up in Gloversville, New York, a small upstate town that once produced 90% of the nation's dress gloves in its factories. He knows small-town America. He has an uncanny sense of the way life works in the gritty industrial towns of the American Northeast. From the gossip and the resentments to the people and the cafes, Russo chronicles blue-collar America in ways constantly surprising and utterly revealing. His previous works include several novels, one collection of short stories, and a memoir. His 2001 novel, Empire Falls, won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. His newest novel, Everybody's Fool, revisits the characters of North Bath, New York, from his earlier novel, Nobody's Fool. Everybody's Fool is filled with humor, hard times, and people you can't help but love, possibly because their various flaws make them so human. This is classic Russo and a crowning achievement from one of the greatest storytellers of our time. Russo earned a bachelor's degree, a master's of fine arts, and a PhD from the University of Arizona. He has taught fiction at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, and was a professor at Colby College in Waterville. He and his wife live in Camden and Boston. It's my pleasure to introduce Richard Russo.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Can you all hear? Yes. Okay, good, good. Boy, you have to be careful what you get off the net, though. It was true at one point several years ago that I did live in Camden and Boston, and I now live in neither. I now live in Portland, although I still have a house in Camden, should any of you be interested. As a matter of fact, I'm going up there right after I leave here to deliver some furniture for what we hope will be a rental at some point in the not too distant future. It's great to be here. I've done a number of these chats with champions. I like to think you people must be the champions here. Thank you all for coming out on such a gorgeous summer day when you might have found something else to do. But it's wonderful to be here. Last time I was here actually was with my daughter Kate, with whom I had done a small press book with a local publisher, Down East Books. That book tour, I've done a fair number of book tours now. And I'm very near the end of this present one. But that was a special one to be able to do that with my adult daughter. And it's lovely to be back. What I thought I would do here, since this is a sequel, is read a couple of passages. First from Nobody's Fool, which was 23 years ago when that book was written. A little more than that actually now. And then fast forward to Everybody's Fool, which was just published in May, so that you can kind of get a little snapshot of Richard Russo, the writer Richard Russo then, 23 years ago, the one who stands before you today. The first passage, there is a sign that I'm going to be describing, a banner that stretches across Main Street. And in place of a word, there is an arrow pointing up, and so I'll just do that when I get to that part, so you'll know what you would be seeing on the page if you were reading it. Okay, so this first passage is from Nobody's Fool. A block down the street from Hattie's, 2 city workers were taking down the banner that had been strung across Main Street since September, where it had become an object of much derision and discussion. Things are looking in Bath, it said. Some of the town's residents claimed that the banner made no sense because of the arrow. Had a word been left out? Was the missing word hovering in midair above the arrow? Clive People, whose idea the slogan had been, was deeply offended by these criticisms and remarked publicly that this had to be the dumbest town in the world if the people who lived there couldn't figure out that the arrow was a symbol for the word up. It worked, he explained, on the same principle as I Heart New York, which everybody knew was the cleverest promotional campaign in the entire history of promotional campaigns, turning a place nobody even wanted to hear about into a place that everybody wanted to visit. Anybody could see that the slogan was supposed to read, I love New York, not I heart New York. The heart was a symbol, a shortcut. Well, the citizenry of Bath were not fetched by this argument. To most people, it didn't seem that the word up needed to be symbolically abbreviated, brevity being the word's most obvious characteristic to begin with. After all, the banner stretched all the way across the street. There was plenty of room for a 2-letter word in the center of it. In fact, many of Clive Jr.'s opponents on the banner issue confessed to being less than taken with the whole I Heart New York campaign as well. They remained to be convinced that upstate was much better off for it. And now, after 3 months of this new banner, local merchants along Main Street still remain to be convinced that things were looking They were waiting for something more tangible, like the opening of the Sans Souci or groundbreaking on the Ultimate Escape fun park. The new banner, Go Sabertooths, Trounce Schuyler Springs, was even more optimistic. The choice of the word trounce was more indicative of the town's mounting frustration with the basketball team's losing streak to Schuyler Springs than any realistic goal. The more traditional beat had been rejected as mundane and unsatisfying. The real debate had been between trounce and annihilate. The proponents of annihilate had surrendered the field when they were reminded that it was, after all, a 10-letter word. And Bath was a town that had recently established a precedent when it abbreviated the word up. The banner also promised to revive another controversy, this one turning on a point of grammar. Nearly 3 decades earlier, when football had to be dropped due to a post-war decline in the region's population, and the high school's other sports began to show signs that they could no longer compete successfully against arch-rival Schuyler Springs, the high school's principal had decided that it was time to change the school's nickname, the Antelopes, to something more ferocious, in the hopes of spurring Bath's young athletes to greater ferocity. After all, there weren't any antelope within 1,500 miles of them, and all those animals were famous for was running away. So there had been a Name the Team contest, and the saber-toothed tigers were born, all the antelope logos repainted at town expense. Predictably, the whole thing had not turned out well. The fans had immediately shortened the name to the Tigers, which the high school principal thought common and uninspiring and a violation of the contest rules. The best thing about the saber-toothed tiger was its saber teeth, which ordinary tigers didn't have. And the principal insisted that the name not be corrupted even in casual conversation. He'd spent good money repainting all those logos. even if the saber teeth had turned out looking like walrus tusks. If all this wasn't enough, a controversy had erupted on the editorial pages of the North Bath Weekly Journal over whether the plural of saber-tooth should be saber-tooths or saber-teeth. When the cheerleaders led the spell shear, how should it go? The principal said that saber-teeth sounded elitist and silly and dental. The chair of the high school's English department disagreed, claiming that this latest outrage was yet another symptom of the erosion of the English language. And he threatened to resign if he and his staff were expected to sanction tooths as a plural of tooth. Why not? The public librarian asked in the next letter to the editor. Wasn't this, after all, the same English department that had sanctioned antelopes as the plural of antelope? Think about it for a second. The letters continued to pour in for weeks. Borough peoples who had nursed a 20-year grudge against the principal for caving in and allowing history courses in the junior and senior high school to be redesignated social studies, had the last editorial word, reminding her fellow citizens that the saber-toothed tiger was an extinct animal. Food, she suggested, for thought. Nevertheless, this new banner read, "Go Sabertooths, trounce Schuyler Springs." And the men whose job it was to string the banner across the street were more concerned with it than the old banner, which had become gray and tattered in the wind and would not be restrung after the weekend's big game. On the Monday following Thanksgiving, the Christmas lights always got strung. And so, as the new banner was being attended to, the workers and onlookers shouting instructions to one another to make sure that the banner was centered and straight, as if a botched job might affect the outcome of the game, the old banner was allowed to lie stretched across the street in the slush. When the workers were satisfied that the new banner was secure and had climbed down from their ladders, one of them picked up one end of the old banner just as a car drove by and hooked the cord on one of its rear wheels, dragging the banner all the way up Main Street and finally out of sight. Sully, shoveling Miss Burrell's driveway as promised, looked up and saw the banner trail by, though he had no idea what it was. That's Nobody's Fool, 1992. And here we are in the present day with Everybody's Fool.
Yeah.
A banner was strung across Main Street for the Memorial Day weekend. The new North Bath, it said, partnering for tomorrow. This was the brainstorm of Gus Moynihan, the town's new mayor, who had been swept into power the previous year on a tidal wave of born-again optimism. More than a decade after the demise of the Ultimate Escape Fun Park, an economic catastrophe that had ushered in a golden age of self-loathing and fiscal pessimism, deeply rooted in 2 centuries worth of invidious comparison with Schuyler Springs, the town's better-looking twin and age-old rival. Schuyler had long possessed everything to which Bath aspired: a vibrant local economy, an educated citizenry, visionary leadership, throngs of seasonal downstate visitors, an NPR affiliate radio station. Okay, sure, there had been some shitty luck involved. Bath's mineral springs had mysteriously dried up over a century ago, while Schuyler's continued to percolate up enthusiastically from its shale. Schuyler also had a famous thoroughbred racetrack, an acclaimed writer's retreat, and a center for the performing arts. A high-toned liberal arts college. Bath had only a beleaguered two-year community college, as well as a dozen fancy restaurants that served exotic foods like ramps, whatever they were. On the restaurant front, all Bath could boast was its rundown roadhouse tavern, the White Horse, Hattie's Lunch, a donut shop, and the new Applebee's up by the freeway exit. What all this amounted to, everyone agreed, was a complete economic and cultural rut. For a while, the fun park had gotten people's hopes up, but when they were dashed, the collective despair was so profound that the town had even stopped stringing its buoyantly optimistic Main Street banners that had become its dubious trademark, the last of which had read, "Things are looking..." The gloom had lasted until Gus Moynihan, a retired college professor who was renovating one of the grand old Victorians on Upper Main Street, wrote a guest newspaper editorial decrying the town's mordant defeatism and criticizing the current Republican administration's unspoken policies, which could be summed up, he said, in 9 words. No spending. None. Ever. On anything. Why not string one last banner across the street, he suggested. Let's eat dirt. The editorial had struck a chord and made a mayoral candidate its author. Even his opponents had to admit that Gus and his cronies, many of them from away, had run a clever campaign. Let's be Schuyler Springs, was the gist of it. Instead of competing with their obnoxious neighbor, why not take advantage of its proximity? Half the people who came to the racetrack and the Performing Arts Center in the summer had no place to stay and ended up in hotels as far away as Schenectady. Why shouldn't they stay in Bath? Okay, the Sanssouci Hotel and Resort with its nearly 300 rooms had run into legal difficulties, fueled by local resentment, when it became known that the new owners would be using downstate contractors and labor for almost everything. The old hotel's lavish renovations had cost far more and taken much longer than expected, causing it to miss much of the summer tourist trade that first season, and the locals had steadfastly rebelled against its prices in the fancy restaurant. But that didn't mean that the basic concept was flawed, or so the Moynihan crowd had argued. Instead of throwing up roadblocks to entrepreneurship, the town should have offered tax breaks and other incentives. Same deal with restaurants. During the short summer season, desperate, hungry travelers even mobbed the Horse. So why not entice a young chef or two up from New York City? Find out what the hell ramps were and serve them, if that's what people really craved. It wasn't like Schuyler Springs had cornered the world ramps market and refused to share. So overnight, the new password was partnering. Whenever possible, Bath would partner, not only with odious Schuyler Springs and moneyed downstaters, but also with local entrepreneurs in projects of exceptional merit. One of these locals was Carl Roebuck, who most people were surprised to learn was an entrepreneur, having known him all their lives as a con man and an asshole. Carl's father, Kenny, they liked. He built tip-top construction from nothing by working 14-hour days. Like so many men of his generation, he hoped his son wouldn't have to work quite so hard. On that score, he had no legitimate worries. In college, Carl had learned to drink and seduce women and spend his father's money and loathe all things Carhartt, especially the brand's connotation of hard, honest labor. Returning home, he gave no indication that he meant to work at all, if he could help it. Thank you so much. So we're just going to chat for a while. If you have any questions, now's the time.
I know these novels are set in upstate New York, but can you think of a Bath Skylar parallel in Maine?
Let's see. What the whole idea of the Bath Skylar parallel was a lucky town and an unlucky one. Right kind of cheek by jowl. Well, having lived in Camden for many years, and we all know the slogan, don't we? Camden by the sea, Rockland by the smell. Well, but that's what came to mind, and what caused me to hesitate to bring it up is that it might have been true once, and I don't think it's true anymore. When we lived happily in Camden for many years until about 3 years ago. But by the time we had left, it seemed clear that people interested in eating ramps were going to Rockland. And much of the kind of well, Camden was a lot of things. It was and is an incredibly beautiful place. You would never call it a hip place or a trendy place. And so, you know, if you were interested in the arts, if you were a foodie, if you were, you know, any of those things, you were much more likely to be driving down the coast a ways to visit, you know, CMCA and the Farnsworth and to be eating your ramps somewhere down there. And you know, I think Rockland is more of a working harbor. It doesn't have the Camden's harbor, you know, that little postage stamp beautiful harbor that Camden has, that Rockland doesn't, but still Rockland is much the hipper place now, I think. So whatever that, so that's not a great. Can anybody else think of a comparison? I mean, I live in Portland now, and it's interesting that that the reason for Portland's enormous growth over the last 15 years or so, at least, has been its reputation as kind of a hip place. This is where all the artists are. This is where all the chefs have come up from Boston and New York and started restaurants there. And we have a Whole Foods. My God, we can kind of let our voices fall. But it's interesting now that what almost always happens in these situations is that once a town gets a reputation like that, then of course money moves in, and it's not very. I mean, real estate prices go up, and the very people who made it a hip place to begin with can't afford to live there anymore. So the artists now are all moving down to Biddeford and places like that, and you can just. I mean, my wife and I lived there right on the outskirts of the old port, and you could see that beginning to happen already. The hipper folks that made Portland such a place to be for a while, they just can't afford to live there anymore. So there'll be some new thing. Yes, sir.
Yeah, historically, what comes to my mind is the mill towns, Biddeford, Saco, Lewiston, Auburn, the workers on one side of the river and the owners on the other side of the river. So
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. The point was made here is that you see this over and over again, certainly throughout upstate New York, New England, the whole Rust Belt of New York. You see exactly that happening, and of course, when it came time to describe something like that in Empire Falls, that's exactly what I had. It's exactly what I had the Whitings do. And when they're first building Empire Falls, or hiring workers to build Empire Falls, they all live on one side of the river, and then And Charlie Whiting is the one who decided to build his dream house on the other side of the river. And you do see that happening now in places like Biddeford, certainly. And you also see what happened in Empire Falls. You see that playing out again and again. It kind of almost happened in Waterville there for a while, but you do see it happening in places like Biddeford now. Some of the grand old mills are being repurposed in places like that. And you know, buy in Biddeford right now while you can still afford it. That's all. Yes, sir.
Of your books, do you have a favorite?
There are certain books of mine that continue to resonate with me, not so much because they're favorites, but because of who I was and what was going on in my life when they were written. Usually my favorite, I tend not to think about these books very much after they come out, because I'm always at work on another book, and the characters in that book need me, and these people are beyond any help that I can give. So usually my favorite is whatever I'm working on. But that said, there are certain of my books that I have a fondness for, that they're less connected to them than to who I was when I wrote them. The Risk Pool will always have a special place in my heart, because it's a father-son story written when my own father was dying. And I can still remember, you know, authors are kind of like readers in that sometimes our favorite books just remind us of who we were and what it felt like to read them all years later. We may not be able to tell anything about the plot, or we may not remember the characters' names or anything like that, but we remember the feeling that the book gave us when we read it all those years ago. And authors are like that too. I can still remember who I was when I wrote that book about my father dying. Empire Falls was for me an exercise in parental dread, because my daughters were in junior high school. Emily, my older daughter, was just going into high school, and I would see them coming home from school in mid-afternoon, coming toward me up the street under those enormous backpacks that they used to carry, already having evidence of scoliosis in their spines from all of that weight, and knowing too that they were that in junior high school and high school is when, if you're a parent, you realize that your children, whether or not they're good kids, and my daughters were both great girls, and I never doubted them, but I was beginning to doubt the world around them and the kinds of dangers that they were going to, the kind of weight that they were going to have to carry in the world, and what it might do to them. And I kind of Empire Falls was almost, for me, it was a talisman. If I could write about something as horrible as I could imagine, maybe it wouldn't happen to them. Maybe the world would be kinder to them than it was going to be to Miles or to Tick. So that book I will always connect to, just because of my feelings as a father. Yes, sir. Hi.
Recently read that old Cape Magic, which I enjoyed very much. But I was wondering, in the vein of this comment, could you comment on what brought you to write that? It seems different somehow than your others that I've read.
Yeah, I think the connection, if there's a connection between that book and any other book of mine, I think that old Cape Magic and Straight Man are the two books that kind of intersect in a way. They are, first of all, my two lightest books. They're my two most comedic books. I think that old Cape Magic was the book that I had to write coming off of Bridge of Sighs, which was, I think, my darkest, to that point anyway, my darkest and most ambitious novel. And that book kind of hollowed me out. When I was finished with it, I thought, geez, I didn't have an idea for another novel. I felt completely spent. By the time I finished that book, it felt to me like the needle like the needle was right on empty, just bouncing off that little peg, you know. And I started that Old Cape Magic actually as a short story, and I thought that you know, 25 pages in and out. I had a character who would be driving over the Sagamore Bridge onto the Cape, and his job would be to scatter his mother's ashes. He either would or would not accomplish that mission, but it seemed to me like 20-25 pages in and out. I would just write a short story, something light, and it would be fine. That was all that I had the energy for. Didn't quite work out that way, strangely enough. In the way that this is the thing about art, I think, in some ways, is that when you think you're out of gas, very often you're not. It just feels like you are. You're exhausted from whatever your last project was, and you think that you only have so much energy. And the wonderful thing about a new project is that instead of using gas, it actually puts more gas in your tank in some way. But that Old Cape Magic was the kind of book every now and then that a writer gets, like Straight Man, where it's just easier because it's lighter. It's just easier. Straight Man, of all my novels, was the one that gave me almost no pain at all. It just came gushing out. And that Old Cape Magic was also satirical in that way, and it didn't take me, despite the fact that by the second half of the book, the main character, Griffin, now has both his parents' ashes in opposite wheel wells in his car, and he's engaged in conversations with both of his dead parents. Dark as that might seem as a plot point, it really was an easy, almost picaresque novel to write that could not have been much more different from certainly than Bridge of Sighs.
Over here.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you something different.
Yeah.
You were part of a very interesting book about your friend.
Jenny Boyle?
Yes. Could you talk about that a little?
Sure. The question regards my dear friend Jenny Boylan and her book She's Not There, which is a memoir about her finally coming to terms with and admitting in a public way that she was transgendered. She was before this my good friend Jim Boylan. We were office mates at Colby College, and when Jim went through transition, I was actually one of the two people that were there with her during her gender reassignment surgery. This was now over 10 years ago, and I wrote the afterword for Jenny's book, and in that afterword, my principal fear, of course, was that that as a result of this, I was going to lose one of my best friends, which of course did not turn out to be the case at all, although at the time it seemed to me like it might. I happen to know that the book is almost precisely 10 years old, because when that book came out, there was no audio book of it, and the book was just republished this year with my afterword again, and also Jenny's wife Dee Dee has another afterword in it. They are still together after all of these years. Their two sons, who were little boys when this happened, one is now just graduated from Vassar, and the other is a junior at University of Rochester. Because this was an audio book, I had the opportunity to go into the studio and read my afterword aloud, and I just about made it through. And I had not read that. I had not read that since I wrote it. As I say, when a book of mine is done, unless I've been asked to write a screenplay or something like that, I generally don't go back and revisit these things. But I was surprised at how well that held up. I don't want to say I was moved by the essay so much as moved by our continuing friendship and the power of that, that transcends just so much. And I've got a book, I'm going to have a book of essays coming out in another probably year or two. I've got a book of short stories coming out next year, and then a book of essays. And as soon as I read through what I had written, I realized it. But I put together all the other essays. I've still got one to write, and I put together all the other essays that I was planning to include in that collection. And as soon as I reread that afterward, I realized this not only belongs in the book, it's probably the strongest piece of writing in it. So, Jenny and I remain best of friends. We have a kind of shorthand for our friendship over the years. Also, Jenny is a great comic writer as well, and we will often sign off with a kind of shorthand. And the one that we use most, I think, is from Great Expectations, which is from Joe Gargery speaking to Pip, who always says to Pip, "Ever the best of friends, ain't us?" Sure, in the back, yeah.
You have given me so much enjoyment over the years. I just like to pay you back a little bit with a first-hand compliment from Paul Newman.
Wow.
Way back, I think it was '98, we were making Message in a Bottle down in New Harbor. Of course, he was in that.
Yeah.
And luckily, I'm not as dumb as I look. I stood next to him in every group scene. Thought he was genius. And about the second or third time, he looked at me and he said, "I'm sensing a pattern here." And I said, "Well, I'm hoping you adopt me."
Yeah.
And he said, "It's not going to happen." I said, and they weren't supposed to talk to us.
Right.
We were not supposed to talk to them.
Right,
They were
right.
stars and we were extras.
Yeah.
And he started talking to me.
Yeah.
Because he had to, I was there all the time. So I said, I got to tell you, I really loved Nobody's Fool, the movie. I thought it was way underrated. And of course, I had enjoyed the book. And he said, "Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that." He said, "But you know what was really underrated was the book and the author. They said as many honors as he gets," he said, "I will always think of him as underrated." He was really terrific.
Well,
Paul
thank
Newman from the Great.
you for sharing that. I mean, long after Nobody's Fool, we did 3 movies together. We did Nobody's Fool, and of course we did Empire Falls years later. And in between there was the movie that not that many people saw. I still happen to like it a lot. A movie called Twilight, with not the vampire one. The movie with Gene Hackman and Susan Sarandon and Paul Newman and James Garner. You can Netflix it. So we did 3 projects together, and it wasn't like we ever became intimate friends or anything like that. But Paul had this enormous respect for writers and writing. And one of the first calls that I got the day that I found out that Empire had won the Pulitzer. I mean, the phone was ringing right off the hook, of course, because and it would come in. You couldn't tell. You couldn't tell what the order was going to be. Someone that you hadn't heard from in 20 years had seen it, and somehow got my phone number and called, and the Associated Press would call, and then right after the Associated Press would be the Bangor Daily News, and after that would be the New York Times. There was no pecking order or anything like that. It was whoever, when there are 15, 20, 30 people calling at the same instant, I mean, it's just serendipity. When you pick up the phone, one of them is going to come through, and it's not always the one that you would expect. But probably the 5th or 6th call that I got was from Paul, and he never had to identify himself, because as he got older, his voice became much lower and very gruff and gravelly. And he always had a nickname for me. And for a lot of men, especially that he liked who were younger than he was. And you can tell me if he ever called you this. But he would never say Richard or hello or anything. He would never even say hello. He would pick up the phone and this voice would say, "Hot shot." And so, whenever a new book of mine would come out, I would get a phone call and it would say, "Hot shot."
He never called me hot shot.
Never called me hot
You again, I think, was pretty much what he said.
shot. But he is missed. He is missed. And there's some little mice nibbling around this block of Hollywood cheese out there now. This new book. And I think that there would be more nibbles and bigger mice, but and part of the reason that this book was so successful, I think, after a 23-year hiatus, was Robert Benton's wonderful movie and Paul Newman's portrayal of Sully. So otherwise, I don't know how many people would have remembered Nobody's Fool, but they do remember it. And it's interesting now trying to, if you're going to do a Hollywood sequel to this book, you have to deal with the fact that there are no other Paul Newmans. And Jessica Tandy is gone. And God help us, Phillip Seymour Hoffman is gone, who played in one of his first movie roles, Officer Raymer, in that book. And this book was a melancholy experience in that respect because it's a book about memory and it's about the conversations that we continue to have with people who are gone. The characters in this book are all haunted by the past in some way or other. And so it's about all of those. It's about all of those things. But for the movie maker, I don't know how you go about exactly doing a sequel to a movie after all these years when we've lost so many of the great actors from that first film. Man.
I've been fascinated that after 23 years you decide to pick up this story again. Is there something in your life or in your motivations that this was the time when you wanted to tell this story?
This book is dedicated to Howard Frank Mosher, the wonderful Vermont novelist. Howard and I have been friends for years. And our paths still cross a lot. And every time I see Howard, whether in Maine or whether I'm up in northern Vermont somewhere, whenever I see Howard, over the last, really, since 1992, every time I see Howard, he always says, "So what's new with Sully and Rub?" There's a soft spot, and Howard has a heart as big as Vermont, and Rub Squeers, for some reason, Sully's sidekick, just found a place in Howard's heart, and he always asked him, and it was such a great compliment because he always asked as if these people were real, as if I were in touch with them, as if we got together on Skype, once a week, and that I would know there was news to impart, and I would know what it was. And so, for the better part of 20-some years, I was just this source of enormous disappointment to Howard. That I had no news to impart to him about either Sully or Rub until this was when my wife and I were still living up the coast. And I forget where we were, probably at a dinner party or something. Someone told this wonderful story about a guy whose his wife had been bugging him to prune a limb from a tree outside their bedroom window, or her bedroom window. I don't know where did that, but and so he'd been promising and neglecting to do it, and he finally got somebody to a friend of his agreed to meet him there, would bring a ladder, and he would climb the tree, and he would saw off the offending limb. But the next day, the friend forgot, and so this guy, having promised faithfully that by the end of today, this limb would be on the ground, would be gone from outside his wife's window, he decided to take matters into his own hands, went down into the basement or into the garage and got his chainsaw and a length of rope. One end of the rope he ties to the handle of the chainsaw. The other end of the rope he ties to his belt and climbs up into the tree, about 30 feet up, and seats himself on the limb that he's going to prune with his back to the trunk of the tree. Of course, even he's not stupid enough to sit.
Yeah.
So he sits with his back to the trunk of the tree, spreads his knees as far apart as possible, fires up the chainsaw, sitting like this with his back, prunes the limb from the tree. The limb falls 30 feet to the ground. He turns off the chainsaw, unhitches it from his belt, lowers the chainsaw down to the ground, and drops the rope. And only then does it occur to him that in order to rotate on the stub of the limb, of the now severed limb, because it's really only, it's just a nub that he's sitting on. And there's no branch up here to grab anywhere. And there's no limb below him. The limbs below him are of no use. And so there he sits on this nub of branch with no way to rotate there's no way to rotate on it or anything with the limb gone. Before he could have, with the limb still there. And so as the story was told to me, this guy simply has to sit there. He does this around 11 o'clock in the morning, and he has to sit there until his wife comes home from work at 5 in the afternoon. Because they live out in the boonies, and you can just imagine what it's like to sit on a hard tree limb without the ability really to move very much at all. What would your ass feel like after that? Not good, we know that. So anyway, somebody told me, I was thinking to myself, who in the world would do such a thing? And I thought, well, Squeers. And instead of his wife finding him, of course it would be Sully who would find him. And so when I saw Holly one time, he said, as he always did, what's new with Sully and Rub? And I told him this story as if it were. I heard from Rub, and he got stuck in a tree. So I just told him the story, and in telling the story, I just had so much fun telling Howard this story that it must have spurred something. It must have, and I've never had the urge before to go back to another novel of mine. And once it dawned on me that I could make Raymer the main character, that he would have in 10 years he would have failed upward. You know, he would now be the chief of police, and that was kind of an interesting premise too. And I was just off to the races at that point. I didn't really need much else. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ease into your career as a writer, say, as a young adult, or did you start scribbling? I mean, you could write.
I came into the writing game very late, probably 29 before I wrote a story. I was finishing up a PhD in literature at the University of Arizona, and so in some respects, I suppose, reading, doing all of that reading over the better part of a decade, because I did a BA in English and then an MA in American literature, PhD in American literature, and then an MFA in fiction writing. So that was pretty close to a decade. And during all of that time, I was doing little besides reading and grading papers. And so even though it occurred to me very late in the process that Okay. Yes, that's okay. Turn it up. It was very late in that process that it occurred to me that the people in the English department who were having the most fun seemed to be the creative writers. And so I decided to maybe try my hand at writing a story. But I was 29 or thereabouts before it even occurred to me. And I wrote a story and gave it to the director of creative writing at the university, who gave it back to me. And I told him that I wanted to start taking lessons, and asked him, of course, what he thought about the story I'd given him. And I can still remember what he said. He said that most writers, most people who want to be writers, have about 1,000 pages of really, really horrible prose in them that they have to just write out, just expel it, expel all of this. But he said, you, because you've done all of this literature, and because you've been writing papers about literature for the last decade or so, doing all this academic writing, he said, you should know that probably you have 2,000. which turned out to be pretty close to true. No, I had a lot of, when you look at the thing about studying literature, the study of literature, what you're looking at is finished work. You're looking at something that's as good as the artist can make it, and probably that artist has shared it with other artists who have made suggestions and contributions. If you're a writer, it's gone to an editor and then a copy editor, and you're looking at something that is not only as good as the writer can make it, but as good as a number of other people can make it too. The agent, the editor, the copy editor goes through, and so you're looking at that. You're looking at the finished product. What you never see when you're studying literature is all those bad drafts. You never see. And it's fascinating to do that too, because go down to the Kennedy Library in Boston sometime, where they have early drafts of some of Ernest Hemingway's novels and short stories, and just look at his first drafts. They're awful. And that's the way most writers' first drafts are. And for most people, the apprenticeship is a fairly lengthy one. It was certainly lengthy for me, because you can almost take talent off the table for a while. There are just certain skills you need. If you're a musician, you need to play your scales. You need to do your work. You have to. If you're any kind of an artist, whatever. If you're a painter, the brush has to be an extension of your hand. If you're a writer, so much of what you're doing has to be done even before you start thinking. You're making decisions. You have certain instincts that you've learned, either good instincts or bad instincts, and that all comes from just logging in the hours. That's one of the things that Malcolm Gladwell says in his book about creativity, is that they're what they call now the 10,000 hour rule. You just have to put in your 10,000 hours before you can even hope to get them. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And in some cases, 10,000 is 20,000. Yes, sir.
Do you employ a scaffolding that's not apparent in the finished product? Is there an outline or a diagram or?
No. My final job as a writer is to make it look to you folks like I knew what I was doing all along. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I would usually begin a novel, and along about page 75, a character will say something, or I'll write a sentence and I'll realize, oh, that's the first sentence of the book. And so then you go back and you start over again with that first sentence. And now maybe next time you get to page 150 and you introduce a character and you think, oh, this character has to be there right from the start. And so you go back and do it again. This will happen with me often half a dozen times. And so there will be a structure there. by the end of the book, and it will look like scaffolding was involved at some point. But no, there isn't much there at all for me except a character with a problem. And yeah, yes, ma'am.
So, today is the first day of summer, or yesterday was, and I'm wondering what's on your night table to read this summer.
Oh boy, I've got a lot on my night table right now, and some of it may be surprising. It's interesting that I'm almost never reading what other people are reading because I get so many books sent to me by writers and their editors asking for endorsements that very often I'm reading. If I told you what I was reading now, a lot of those books you wouldn't be able to find for another 6 months because I'm reading them either in manuscript or in an advanced reader's edition. I just finished, Hannah Tinty, who wrote a wonderful book called The Good Thief, probably a decade ago, and I've been waiting for another book of hers, which just came, and so I just finished that. But that book won't be out for another 6 months ago, and I've got two or three others of that sort. I can tell you the titles, but it wouldn't make any
How
sense
about
to you.
books that have been a big influence on you?
Well, right now, the one book I'll mention to you that's on my table right now, and some books that I plan to read. Summer is a time when I tend to give myself a little bit more leeway and read the books that I've wanted to read all year long, and for some reason or other, I just haven't been able to. Right now, I'm finishing a wonderful collection of letters between, of all people, Ross MacDonald and Eudora Welty. It's called Meanwhile There Are Letters, and I cannot recommend it if you... Number one, they're both great writers, but they're kind of an odd couple. Ross MacDonald, you may remember, was a kind of noir, tough guy, writer of detective fiction. And Eudora Welty, you know who Eudora Welty is, I don't need to explain her. But the oddest of all literary couples who had this astonishing friendship bordering on love affair. Almost strictly through letters. They only met each other on like half a dozen occasions. And the letters are just wonderful. Last year I was absolutely determined and not yet managed to read the most recent Kate Atkinson book. I love her work. This one's called A God in Ruins. And After Life After Life was, I thought, one of the best books of the last 5 years or so. So I'm anxious to read that. And Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant I managed to miss so far this year. I intend to read that. So that's part of that's on my table. Yes.
This is sort of a personal question, but...
Okay. I can dodge it.
We're from away, from Arizona, 15 years in Tucson, and we've been fortunate to spend the last 6 summers here with our grandchildren and our daughter and son.
Nice.
Yes, and so if I gave them their phone number to you, would you recommend the University of Arizona to those
So you're thinking, all right, University of Arizona, in-state residents.
Yeah.
But they're looking. Let me guess. They're looking at Bowdoin.
No, the parents are looking at you. The kids are looking at you.
Oh, okay. All right.
We just have to convince the parents.
$60,000 a year on the one hand. Yeah, I don't know what the University of Arizona is now. But boy, it was a deal. It was a deal when I was there.
Did you like it?
Someone from upstate New York end up at the University of Arizona?
I actually go into that a little bit in my memoir called Elsewhere, I used to tell people before writing that book that I went there. I had all sorts of glib reasons for going there, but basically what happened was that my mother was trapped living in a house owned by her parents, my grandparents, and she was desperate to get out of there and build a new life somewhere. And so she started leaving little hints around the house about places that I might want to go to college, places that she wanted to live. She didn't tell me about her plan, but that's what she was doing. And so somewhere along junior high school, maybe my first year in high school, for some reason, Arizona Highways magazine started turning up on the coffee table. And towards the end of this spectrum of things, and she researched the University of Arizona. First she convinced me that I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was a kid. And then she did research and discovered that the University of Arizona had a great anthropology program. And so she kept leaving these little breadcrumbs, which I dutifully scarfed up. And the biggest surprise came in the spring of my senior year. I was the last one in my class that learned how to drive because we didn't have a family car. And I just said at one point to my mother, and I was working part-time, so I had the money. I said, well, can't we just buy a beater? I'd like to be able to drive during my last 6 months here before going away to school. And my mother agreed. It was just the damnedest thing. And so she agreed to let me buy this underpowered Ford Galaxy that had ball tires, and we put new tires on it. But the reason she let me buy the car was that we were going to need it to get to Arizona. And so we hitched up a U-Haul containing all of her worldly belongings, or the ones that she could put in a U-Haul, and we drove all that way. I dropped her off in Phoenix, where she didn't have a job, didn't know how to drive, and had no place to live. And we had 2 weeks to figure all that out, including teaching her how to drive. And of course, by that time I had figured out that if I was successful in teaching her how to drive, I didn't have a car anymore. So anyway, that's the short version. It's all in Elsewhere. This is the 5-minute version. In Elsewhere, it's hundreds of pages to get to exactly the place that you are right now.
One more question?
One more question? Last question? Yes, sir.
The majority of your books use third-person narration, but I noticed in Straight Man you use first-person. Why did you choose that for Straight Man?
I think that third person is just a natural way to tell a story. And it's interesting because if you look at 19th century novels, that was kind of the conventional wisdom. Not only was third person the way that you told a story, for the most part, but third person omniscient, where you have the ability to go from one character to another and plumb into their individual thoughts and feelings and emotions and all of that. That was just considered to be, in the 19th century, the default mode for telling stories. That's no longer the case. I mean, we even have people writing novels in the second person now, which would have been unthinkable at the time. And even writers who write in the third person often write in a very limited third person point of view, or in a face point of view where you don't go into any character's thoughts. Most of Hemingway's, for instance, short stories are a face third person, where you're looking at a character, but you never go into their thoughts. What they're thinking and feeling is determined from what they say and do. And those who are using third person now, they use a particular kind of third person where you only go into one character's thoughts, and that's very much like first person. It has exactly the same limitation on it. However, the overriding reason to do something in first person is because the person who's telling us the story has a very idiosyncratic voice. And that's what you're after. So Holden Caulfield, you cannot imagine Catcher in the Rye being told in anything but the first person, because Holden Caulfield is speaking to us. Right? You can't imagine Moby Dick beginning with "Call him Ishmael." It just doesn't work. And the reason I use first person in Straight Man was simply because it seemed to me that William Henry Devereux Jr. had a very idiosyncratic voice that would be very entertaining to listen to. Right? He describes himself as an exasperating man. And a lot of that comes out of his very, very strange, idiosyncratic way of addressing us. Thank you all so much.